Excellent. Right. Good morning. The recording has now started. So welcome to the Audit and Assurance revision course, exam preparation day, whatever way you want to look at it. So this is going to focus on exam technique. I'm going to spend time really on the longer questions. I mean, the short form questions will then feed out of that, but I think they're sort of mostly knowledge based, which is not really what we're here for today. Here we're for the longer form questions, a bit of a recap of the syllabus, exam technique, those sorts of things. So I'm hoping that you'll get some benefit from that. We will start shortly and we'll look at sort of probably 2 longer breaks. So the timetable is up to 2. That included some lunch, so we'll maybe finish a wee bit earlier than that because we'll take a couple of longer breaks and then you can just go and get some lunch after the course. So that's the timings. So we'll probably have 3 breaks, one of which would maybe be shorter. So we'll see how that goes across the day. I'll try and intersperse them. So as I said, we're going to focus on questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you probably chronologically through an audit, I think is the best way to do it. So sort of starting at the start of an audit, what do we need to do? And then feeding that into the syllabus, because the syllabus broadly does follow that audit process. So it's like, right, okay, we start at the start of an audit with our acceptance of a client. What are the things we need to think about at that point? Then we feed into, right, we've now got a new client. How do we actually start thinking about the audit? So we start to think about the controls in place at the client, understanding what that business does, all of those things. Then we're into the planning stage of the audit. So we're going to think about identifying the audit risks and think that comes up a lot. So we need to think about that. And then we'll finish off by going through the substantive procedures and the final reporting. So depending on how quick or slow we manage to do that, we should get at least 1, maybe 2 questions done on each of those, some of which I'll get you to do in full. So I will give you a bit of time to look at them, or at least parts of them in full, some of which I'll just get you to do a plan. Because one of the things I really want to come out of today is that you learn how to plan your answers, because what a lot of students do is they just bang straight into writing out an answer and they don't think about the planning. They don't think about, essentially they don't think about all the benefits that the new software gives you in terms of how you can actually go about building an answer. Okay, so I'm going to think about a little bit about that as we go through. Okay, so is that okay? Have you any questions before we start? So, give me a question in the chat if you've got any, or give me a thumbs up or a green tick if you're good to go, you're happy, ready to do it. Yeah, okay, right, we're good to go. Okay, so look, because there's not that many of us, do feel free to jump in at any stage and ask questions. Pop them in the chat or unmute and just ask me anything. But I'm going to go through fairly quickly because I want to try and get through as many questions as we can. And I always think, be prepared to do a little bit of work. Whenever I say here, right, go and have a go at this question and do this, go and do it. Don't be tempted to go, oh, well, I'll go and have a cup of coffee and then I'll come back and see what he says about this answer. We're getting to the stage where we're right at the exam now. So really do try and give it a go. Try and implement the things that I'm talking about, because the way I think about it is that in a taught course, it's sort of, it's 80-20 principle. So in a taught course, it's 80% me giving you the stuff. Whereas in a revision course like this, it's the other way around. I'm giving you the 20% and you've got to spend the 80% applying it or practicing applying it. And I know that can be a bit tricky in an audit course on a Sunday. So I do get that, but do your best and pop any questions in as we go. Okay. So just before I talk about any content, I just want to think broadly about some exam technique. Okay, so exam technique to think about. Okay, and in order of priority, essentially, number 1 is timing. Okay, look, you guys, I think, have been in courses with me before. It's fundamental that you get your timing right. So in this one, you've got 1.8 minutes per mark. So take each requirement and apply this at the start. From that, you need to work out time to finish each requirement. Okay, so you could take that sort of big, like zoom out and go, well, okay, we've got sort of 30 short form questions, or 30 marks for the short form questions. So that's going to be 54 minutes. So I need to have these short form questions done in 54 minutes. Or I would probably zoom in a little bit on that and say, well, I want to have the first section of short form questions done by this time, and then the second section done by this time. And then when it comes to the longer questions, break that down into each requirement. You know, say, let's say the first bit's 10 marks. Okay, and then you go part B, maybe it's another 10 marks, so you got 18 minutes. Then part C is maybe 3 marks. So you're maybe going for, what's 3 times 1.8? Let's just call it 5 minutes. Okay, doesn't have to be exact. So you're just going to say to yourself, right, I'm going to be finished part A by this time, I'm going to be finished part B by this time. And you know what? As soon as it comes to that time, you leave it, you move on. Okay, so really, really important that you do that. The next thing that's really important is have a technique for each section. Okay, now it's not so much in this paper, but you know, you do have those short form questions. So for the short form, you might decide to do the easy ones first. So you might have a first run through on any easy questions. Okay, that's one way to do it. Okay, or you might say, right, well, look, what my technique is for these multiple choice questions is I narrow it down to however many I can do. And then I, you know, so you say, right, okay, I rule out B, I rule out D. So now I got a choice between A and C. And you then spend a little bit of time going through the question to see, is there anything else that triggers you to go, oh, well, it couldn't be A, so it has to be C. And in that way, by getting rid of the ones that couldn't be right, you're left with the ones that are. So those are some sort of techniques to think about on the short form. But in this question, in this paper, they're generally speaking knowledge-based, little bit of application. So, you know, what you just got to do is know your stuff for those first bits. It's really in the long form where the question technique comes in. Okay, so for the long form, see below. Okay, so this is really what I'm going to focus on in a little bit more detail whenever we come to it. Check how many marks are available for the requirement. Okay, so first port of call is don't even read the scenario. You just go to the requirement and you go, right, okay, this requirement it requires me to do this. And there are 8 marks available for it. Okay, now you're going to know from that broadly how many marks there are per point. So know from today or practice how many marks are generally available for that type of requirement. Okay, so you know we'll talk about this as we go through, but for something like a substantive procedure, you're looking at 1 mark. So if they don't say how many substantive procedures, you'll be able to tell from the fact that the question is 5 marks that you need to make 5 points. And you don't want to make too many more than that, because what students tend to do in this paper, and you do have students that come out and think, oh, well, I've definitely passed that. I've got all the points. Even when I look at the marking scheme, I've got all the points, but they need to be well explained. Okay, now when you start to look at some of the other requirements, so requirements where you maybe need a little bit more development, well, then you might be getting more than 1 mark. Okay, so you're going to get 1 mark for like a well-described procedure. You might get 2 marks. Well, generally for controls, if you're looking for, well, what is the control and then how are you going to test it? Well, that would be 2 marks. But for some of the other ones, you know, like audit risks, which we'll look at, you'll get 2 marks because those are a bit more tricky. They're a bit more difficult. So we'll maybe get a mark for saying what the risk is, what could be overstated or understated, and we'll get another mark for going on and saying, well, why is that the case, and explaining it. Now, you need to know that. You need to, whenever you come to the requirement, be able to say, oh, well, this is an audit risk one, so I know I'm going to get 2 marks if I explain it well. Or this is a substantive procedure one, I know I'm going to get 1 mark, because otherwise you don't know how much to write. You don't know how many points to make. Okay, so it's super important that you break it down in this way and you understand how you're going to achieve those marks. Okay, so you gauge from that and then you write the requisite amount to achieve those marks. Okay, so when you're doing that, work on about 2 lines per mark. And fully explain everything. Okay, fully explain everything you say. Again, so important. Students do this paper, and what they do is they essentially write the answer out as if it was a mark plan. So they put a short heading and say, you know, like, let's say one of the audit risks is that you've got a temporary accountant in place. So the temporary accountant is in place, therefore there's a risk that they're inexperienced or they don't know the systems and they could be making errors, or they may not know the controls. The controls could fail and they wouldn't be able to pick it up. And that would mean that anything could be overstated or understated. Okay, so that's the audit risk, and you're looking at maybe 2 marks for what I've said there. Whereas the student will go, oh, well, the audit risk is that there's a temporary accountant. Okay, now you've identified that. And even if you go to the mark scheme probably says temporary accountant, 2 marks. And you think, oh, well, yeah, I said there was a temporary accountant. Yeah, you did, but that's all you said. You know, you're not going to get the marks for just very short, succinct bullet points in this. It just doesn't happen. And I think that's one of the big mistakes that students make, is that they go in thinking, well, I'm just going to say exactly what it is. And then, you know, it's obvious, because that's the other thing. And students will do this a lot, is they sort of assume that the examiner knows what they're talking about. Because I could say to you, you say to me, what's the audit risk here? And as long as we're 2 sensible people and with accounting knowledge, I could say, well, you know, there's a temporary accountant in place. And you, as let's say you're my audit colleague, you would know from what I've said there that what I mean is there's a temporary accountant in place, and therefore there could be mistakes that they've overlooked. They're maybe not that experienced. They maybe don't know the business that well. Therefore, this audit is higher risk. Now, you could easily assume that the examiner knows that just from you saying, well, this is there's a temporary accountant in place. And they would, but they won't give you the marks. Okay, so the examiner knows that, and it's very frustrating because I do mark audit papers for a different qualification. So I mark hundreds of papers, and I can tell from the answers that the person knows the answer, but they haven't written it. Like if you write down, oh, well, there's a real audit risk here because there's a temporary accountant in place. I know that you now know the answer to this. And it's very frustrating because I've got 2 marks to award for that. And I'm giving you a half there for saying there's a temporary accountant. And if you feed that through the paper, you've actually done really badly just by identifying all of the points. But actually, you knew enough to get an unbelievable mark because you identified all the points. Okay, so really don't fall into that trap, because I do have a lot of students who feel like they're going to do really well in this exam because in their practice, they're identifying all the points and thinking that's enough. And they just come out and they don't do particularly well. Okay, so that's the process for these longer ones. And we're going to focus in a little bit more on that as we go through. Okay, does that make sense so far? So does this all, I know I'll have mentioned some of this as we go through, or we went through the course, but are we happy with that? Give me a thumbs up or a green tick if you're happy. Give me a question if there's anything you want to clarify, anything that doesn't make sense. So we're all good. Right, okay. Great. Okay, look, I'm also going to keep this fairly succinct in terms of just key points that you need to realize. The other thing that I'm just going to focus on here, and then we'll get stuck into some of the content, is answer planning. Okay. Now this I will talk about. Form an answer plan for the long questions. Now, you are now at a big advantage on this over students who didn't do it on computer, because what I used to say to students is, right, get your piece of paper, and as you read through the scenario, write out or take bullet points or highlight or make notes to plan out your answer. Okay, so the process for this, and this is something that I want you to focus on today as we go through. The process is, as you read through the scenario, write bullet points, or headings. Okay, so you read through the scenario, you write bullet points or headings. Take my example of the temporary accountant. That would be your heading or your bullet point. Audit risks, there's a temporary accountant in place. Now, if you need to say something more than that to remind yourself of what it is, write a little bit more. But that to me would be enough for me on my first read through, temporary accountant in place. Now, this is much better in the computer because what you're able to do is you're able to add lines in between, obviously, because it's a word processor. So whereas in the past you had to make your plan separately, but now your plan is part of your answer. So you're just starting your answer when I say plan. So you're starting your answer by reading through the scenario, making those bullet points or headings. And then I just don't want you to go straight in and start elaborating on them. What I want you to do is, don't take them chronologically. Take a few minutes and prioritize them. My spelling come under the further. Ah, there we go. Okay, prioritize them by the ones you feel most comfortable with. What does that mean? It means they are obvious. okay? Because those are the ones that are going to be in the answer plan, believe it or not. And you can talk about them, because that's going to get you more marks. Okay, now I've taught this long enough to know that if I do a question in class, I'm going to go through the answer and I'm going to get thrown, let's say it's an audit risk question again, I'm going to get thrown 5 audit risks that are not on the answer plan. Okay, now you may or may not get marks for them. Probably not, because by the time that answer plan comes out the other side of the exam process, they'll have been through all the student papers. And if there are ones that keep coming up that are relevant, they'll put them in the answer plan and they would have got marks. So the odds are that if you're coming up with something that's not on the answer plan, you're probably not going to get marks. You might, but you're probably not. So what does that mean? It means that you need to find a way to be consistently getting the ones that are on the answer plan. And guess what? When you write exam papers, and again, I know this because I write exam papers, you are trying to put in some, like let's say you've got 8 audit risks that you're looking for. I want at least 4 of those audit risks to be big, fat, obvious risks, because I want to enable an averagely well-prepared student to pass the exam. And this is the way we look at it, okay? So there's 4 fairly obvious ones in there. And what you need to do is you need to get them first, get them under your belt, get over the line, get to a pass, and then start fiddling around with the ones you're not sure of, the ones that may or may not be on the answer plan. So you need to have that thought process at the forefront of your head, not just be thinking, oh, well, I'm going to just list out all the risks I've identified, and then I'm going to talk about them one by one in the order they came up in the scenario, because they won't necessarily be in the order. So I don't put all of the big obvious risks at the start. I'm going to feed them through the scenario. You need to pick them out. You need to talk about those big, fat, obvious ones first. And then you can go on to the other ones that may or may not be on the plan as and when you get the chance. And then once your time is up, you just move on. That's the way to pass. You get up to a pass in the first part of the time available. You know that those are the obvious ones. And then you spend the rest of the time trying to eke out up and over above a pass. Okay, so don't do it chronologically. Take a few minutes, prioritize them by the ones you feel most comfortable with, the ones that are most obvious, the ones you can talk about, the ones that are going to get more marks because they're definitely on the audit plan. Okay, then expand on those ones first. Then move on to the rest. And obviously, when the time is up, move on. Okay, so you get the obvious ones out there first. You talk about them. You're then left with other ones. Talk about those. And then when your time is up, you move on and you just leave it and forget about it and just go on to the next question. Again, think of this like a tennis player or a golf player. They don't think about the last shot. So they're not beating themselves up over the fact that they put the last shot in the rough or the last shot was out. They forget about it, move on, and they just start with the next shot. So when you've done a question, it's done, forget about it. There's nothing you can do about it. Either it went well or it went badly. Doesn't matter. You've got another question to do now. So you got to just put it out of your mind. And that sort of rising panic, the worrying about what's happened in the previous questions, you got to just find a way to not think of it that way. Focus on the next question, prioritize that, and then just keep going. Okay, so look, I like to keep things in 3. So that's 3 things that we can really focus on. If you do these 3 things, you're pretty much on the verge of passing, okay? You just got to know enough of the syllabus at that point to get over. So timing, keep to it, work it out at the start, say I'm going to finish this question by this time, and when that time is up, you move on. Have a technique for each question. Decide in the short forms, are you going to do them all leave out the ones you can't do, flag them and come back to them? Or are you just going to try to keep within your time and do them? Up to you, but make sure you've got a plan. Don't go in there thinking, well, see how it goes on the day. Okay. When it comes to the long form section, you start with how many marks are available. You know from that how many marks generally you get for this type of question, and you write enough to get that. Broadly looking at 2 to 2.5 lines per mark, but you've got to fully explain everything you say on that one. If you're someone who doesn't do that a lot, use because. Okay, keep saying because this, because that. Other ones, mention the name of the business. Okay, that's going to stick or help you stick to that point of fully explaining. If you use it because, you're saying ABC company should be doing this because, or there's a risk with ABC company because this, and the because makes you expand your point beyond what you would have done before. And mentioning the name of the business makes it relevant to the scenario. Form an answer plan, read through it, write your bullet points. Those are your headings. Those are the things you're going to talk about. Prioritize them by the ones that are going to be on the mark plan. Expand on those, move forward through them, try to get up to a pass, and then try the rest. But once the time is up, you move on. Okay, are we happy with that? Give me a green tick, a thumbs up. Let me know. Are we on track? Have you any questions? Happy to take them, unmute or pop it in the chat. Right, okay, let's just have a think about where we're going to start then. Okay, so the start of the content here. So I'm going to broadly start with a new engagement. Okay, so when you've got some sort of a new engagement, well, that means that you're looking for a new client or you've just got a new client. So there are certain things that you're going to have to do at that point. So you're going to have to go through the appointment process. Okay, so you're thinking about assessing management integrity. You're thinking about any reasons not to accept the audit. Okay, because of course you'll get a response from the previous auditor. Remember, you have to go out to them, ask them if there are any reasons that you shouldn't accept the auditor. There will also be the preconditions for the audit. Okay, so that's things like, are you going to be able to get the information from the client? So there are certain preconditions. So you need to be able to get the information from the client. They need to be using an acceptable set of standards that you can work towards. They need to have internal controls in place. Okay, so all of those things you need to consider in terms of, right, well, look, can we actually accept this client? Other things that we might think about, have we got the knowledge, ability to actually do the audit? So have we got the staff? Have we got the resources available to undertake this audit? Are we suitably independent? Okay, and all of those things will feed into whether or not we can actually go ahead and do this audit. If we don't trust management, and that's sometimes called client screening. Okay, so if we don't trust management, well then maybe we shouldn't be doing the audit. If there are any reasons that the outgoing auditor comes back with, so maybe the outgoing auditor says, oh, well, yeah, we had a problem getting access to information, or we didn't trust management, or there were other professional reasons that we shouldn't take this on, well, then we don't take on the audit. If the preconditions aren't there, if we can't get all information, or we think we won't be able to, if they haven't got any controls in place, if they're using some strange financial reporting standards that we don't know, well, then we're not going to do that audit. Do we have the knowledge and ability? So if we don't have the people within, or they're all away on study leave that month, or whatever, well, then we can't do it. And when it comes to independence, we'll talk a little bit about ethics very shortly. But when it comes to the independence, well, are we suitably independent from the client to enable us to actually do this work? Okay, so those are all the things you need to think about. Remember, this is the start of the process. So we're just thinking about taking on a new client. So how might this come up? So for each bit, I want to think, right, how might it come up? I'll break us in with just a short question. So let's look at March, July 20. Actually, I'll pop the papers that I'm going to use. I'm going to stick to recent papers, which I always do whenever we're doing this sort of thing. We want to see what the examiner's thinking at this time. So actually, let me pop the papers in. I was going to look them, just by the way, I went to the ACCA software and it's under maintenance today. So that's why I'm doing them in here. So papers I am going to be using today, sorry, they've disappeared here. Right, March, July 20. So that's the one we're working on here, March, July 20. So that should be in the chat now. There it is. March, June 21. And September, December 21. Okay. 1, 2, 3 papers. Okay, so there's 3 papers in the chat. And if you're watching this on the recording, they are, you can look up at the top left corner of the screen and you can see, so you've got September, December 21, March, June 21, and March, July 20. As I said, sort of recent papers to make sure that we're sticking to the sorts of things and the sorts of style that the examiner has at the minute, because there is a team that write the papers, so you do see subtle changes in style over time. So it is worth having a look at recent papers to try and get to grips with how they're likely to be asked. Okay, have we got those? Give me a thumbs up if you got the papers to come through there. You're good to go. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, super duper. So the one I'm going to look at is March, July 20. I think it's question 1. Yeah, we'll come to the engagement letter in a second, but I'm mostly interested in this bit. Okay, so it's this bit here. Explain why the following factors should have been considered prior to accepting this client as a new, or this as a new client. Okay, so you'll need to go back and have a read through the scenario. It's not massively difficult, but again, these are the things we talked about as having to look at before you have a new client. So all I want you to do is have a look, read the scenario. I'm not going to give you loads of time. I'm only going to give you a few minutes for this one because it's really just an introductory one. So have a read through the scenario. Scenario is not fundamental to this one, but it will help you to sort of think about, right, well, oh, well, they should have looked at this or they should have looked at that. Okay, I'll give you, let's say, 6 minutes. I'll put a timer on screen. If you have any questions as you do it, pop it in the chat. Right. Okay. So hopefully you've had to think about that. As I said, the scenario is not particularly relevant to this type of question. So when you're able to skim the scenario and go, well, actually, they're not mentioning anything really about accepting. That means I'm just using knowledge, which means that I've got 5 marks. I've got 5 things to talk about. I'm thinking about 1 mark for each of those 5 things. So 5 marks, 5 items, which means what I don't want to be doing is I don't want to be writing loads and loads and loads and loads. Okay. Now the answer does that and goes into too much detail. So if we look at the answer, and I mean, this is just what we talked about. So for example, talk about engagement letter in just a second. Okay, factors to accept the outgoing auditor's response. So just to take you through broadly what we were talking about, we need to contact the previous auditor and get all relevant information. And we should consider the response to see whether there's any reason we shouldn't accept it. So that's the key things you should have been saying here. So ask the outgoing auditor for a response about the client, ask for any reasons you shouldn't accept it. And if they say anything, well, then we can't accept it. But don't go on any more than that. It's only 1 mark. Got to go on to the next one. Management integrity. Is there any reason that they lack integrity? If so, there would be a greater risk of fraud, intimidation. And if there are any concerns, don't accept it. Again, only 1 mark. Don't want to say too much. Preconditions for the audit. So make sure that those preconditions are present, acceptable financial reporting standard. And this is what I mean. I'm just thinking about how to use the examiner's answers here. This is too much, okay? Like you're not going to be expected to be able to write all of that in this time. This first bit, so this bit here, that's going to be enough. Okay, now if you go on to say that, I think it's probably a waste of time because there's only 5 marks available here. You're only going to get 1 mark for this first bit. And again, when I'm marking, oftentimes there's maybe 3 marks available for something. I've given the 3 marks and the student writes on and on and on and on. Well, at that point, I just leave. I don't even read the rest of what you've written because I've given you your 3 marks and I've gone in this one. If you'd written this first bit, I've given you your mark, I'd be gone. I'd be going on to the next question. So don't waste your time by writing on stuff that is not even going to be read because you've already got your 1 mark. Independence and objectivity. So are there any threats to independence? So for example, do any of the staff have shares in the company? I'm going to talk about ethics in just a minute. So something brief about that. And do we have the resources? All you're saying there is, do we have the relevant experience? Do we have the time available? And of course, can we act in accordance with standards? If we do, well then yes. If not, we don't. So we're keeping it fairly short and succinct, but you can see that they're always taking 2 parts to the question. You're saying what you're going to do, consider whether there are any threats and why you're doing it, because if you don't, you can't accept the audit. So what is it? Explain. Why? Reason. And a lot of students will just do the first bit. They'll explain it, but they won't then give the reason, the because. And it's the because in this type of question, in this type of exam, where you're going to get your marks. So it's really important to get that. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? Give me a thumbs up if you're happy with that. If you didn't have those points, that's broadly what you were thinking, but right, okay, good. Okay, just before we leave this question and the sort of starting point, other things we need to think about are the engagement letter. And this one comes up a bit, so let's just have a quick look at it. Explain the purpose of an engagement letter and list 4 items. Now, this is another good point here to make, because when you've got a list, well, then you need to be able to recognize that actually that's not one where you're going to get 1 mark. List equals half a mark. Now, I know they say 4 items, so you then know that that's going to be half a mark. But in questions where they don't, if they ask for a list, well, then that list is only going to be half, okay? Whereas explain is going to be 1. So you need to know, again, read the requirement, think about the marks, build your answer. Okay, I'll give you 3 minutes. I haven't said anything about this. What's the purpose of an engagement letter? So we've accepted the client. We've got an engagement letter. What is it? And list 4 things you'd expect to see in it. Okay, have a go. Right, okay, so looking at this one then, purpose of an engagement letter. Well, look, all I want you to think about the engagement letter as is the contract. So it is the contract between the firm and the client. It clarifies what's expected between the two. It makes sure that it's all signed off. You've officially accepted it and the client has agreed to make payment, and it sets out the conditions. Okay, so just think of it as the contract between the two, and that's why we have it. What's going to be included in it? Well, what's in a contract? There's going to be what you're going to do. There's going to be what you expect management to do. There's going to be the fee that's involved. There's going to be what you are expected to produce at the end of it, the form of the report. It's going to be signed by both parties. There's going to be logistical arrangements in it. Okay, so once you know that it's the contractual terms of the audit, well, then it's pretty obvious what's going to go in it. because you need to set out how the audit's going to be done and what are the responsibilities of the parties involved in that audit. So in the answer, that's exactly what they go into. Okay, so we're looking at purpose of an engagement letter. So these are the points that we made anyway, but let's be clear. So sets out the responsibilities of the party, forms the basis of the contract, outlines the terms and conditions. That's what an engagement letter is. What's included in it? Now, these things, by the way, are listed in the mind maps. We talked about them in the sessions, but they're also in ISA 210. So this is a list from ISA 210. These are the things that are actually expected. It's a good list to know because it comes up reasonably regularly. So when you're going through these answers, I'd be extracting these things. I mean, if I personally was doing the papers now, I think I would have like a OneNote or some sort of notes app on my phone, maybe the iNotes, and I'd just extract this sort of thing, copy and paste it so that I could be looking at that every so often and just reminding myself of it. So objective and scope, responsibilities of each party, the financial reporting framework we didn't mention, content of the report, legislation, communication, that some misstatements might not be discovered. Remember, you're not there to discover everything. Planning and performance, logistics, fees, receipt of the engagement letter, use of internal audit if required, anything that's going to third parties, restrictions on liability if there is any, and arrangements, logistics to get information. Okay, does that make sense? Are we happy with that? Is there anything you want to ask? So give me a thumbs up or a tick if you are happy. Those are the sorts of things you're thinking, or at least now you're like, right, okay. And if not, opportunity for chat or questions. Right, okay. Let's keep going then. So one more topic I'll just touch on and then we'll have a break. Okay, ethics comes up all the time, either in the short form or in the long. We need to be able to deal with it. We need to know the principles. Okay, and the principles are integrity, objectivity, professional competence, due care, professional behavior, confidentiality. Okay, so how are they likely to come up? Short, knowledge-based. What's the definition? So integrity is acting in a straightforward and honest way. Objectivity is not having any bias or acting with undue influence towards the client. Professional competence, being able to do the work, and due care, doing it in a professional way at all times. Professional behavior, not to do anything to bring the profession into disrepute. And confidentiality, well, what it sounds like. So making sure that you act in a confidential way at all times. Well, maybe not at all times. You could release the information if it was in the public interest or if the client allowed you to do so. Okay, so that definitions of those are important. Application of them is usually more through the ethical threats. So the threats to these are self-review, self-interest, advocacy, okay, so let's think about those ones first. So we've got self-review, sounds fairly straightforward, and it usually is. That's potentially reviewing your own work. Now, there's certain work that you can prepare and review if it's not material, if it's computational in nature, if it's not making management decisions. Well, then someone in your firm could do it, and then you as the auditor could review it. Okay, so it could be that you do have some element of that. But of course, you're going to have some safeguards in place. So remember, the key thing for all of these is there any way to reduce the threat to an acceptable level? Okay, so you could have safeguards in place. So those safeguards for self-review could be having separate teams, having them sign non-disclosure agreements between the teams, making sure that you're not making any management decisions. Okay, all of those things will ensure that self-review is not a big issue. If you can't put those in place, well then you can't do the work. And there's certain things you can't do. So for example, for a listed company, you can't prepare the accounts and audit them, whereas you can do that for an unlisted company as long as you've got all the safeguards in place. And for tax work, you can prepare the tax computation, but you can't offer tax advice if it's material. So there are certain things you can't do. For advocacy, well, then we need to be careful that we're not speaking on behalf of the client. Okay, so we need to make sure that anything we say is not seen to be speaking on behalf of the client. And it's a bit of an odd one because it could be seen even if it sort of feels like there's not a big issue there. So things I've seen are like, yeah, so the auditor has been invited to the listing party for a client. Okay, so a client's about to become listed and the auditor has been invited to the party because he's part of, you know, the relationship for the financial statements. Well, that could be seen as an advocacy threat because you could be seen, okay, you could be seen to be speaking on behalf of the client. Okay, just by being there, people might think, oh, well, the auditor must think this is a good company to go listed. So therefore, I think that I'm going to invest. Okay, so you could be seen to be. And so it's not necessarily the fact that you are saying anything. It's the fact that you could be seen to be speaking on behalf of the client. Okay, other ones, familiarity. Can't spell. And intimidation. Okay, so familiarity threats can arise by having a personal relationship with someone. So you're the auditor and they're working in a firm and you know them or you're related to them or you've built up a long relationship. So remember, you've got the auditor rotation rules. So recommended after 10 years for unlisted companies have to be rotated, the audit partner, every 5 years for a listed company with no return within 2 years. That's to stop you being influenced by the client. So you may be less likely to actually raise any issues. So again, be able to identify those and suggest safeguards around rotation or removing people from the audit. Don't go necessarily straight to, well, don't actually do the audit. Intimidation then is usually around fee income or not getting other work. So remember, you've got fee income rules where you can't have more than a 10% of recurring fee income for an unlisted company, 15% for listed, and just make sure that you're hitting all of those and make sure you identify that if you're taking on more work, well, that may well increase your fees from that client and that may impact on this. You may not be able to take on that work. Okay, look, you need to know the principles, you need to know the threats, you need to be able to apply safeguards so that if these threats come up, well, then you've got a way to deal with them, okay? Like, for example, let's see, what one did I pick? September, December 21. Question 1. Now, again, you don't usually get a big, like giant ethics question. It usually forms sort of a few marks of a bigger question. So look, it's not a massive question. It's not going to take you a long time. So This is it. Peach, scenario 1 of September, December, question 1. Okay. Sorry, it's part C of scenario 1 in September, December 21. Okay, just have a read through it. Look at the details. They want 2 ethical threats and an appropriate safeguard. It's only 4 marks. I'm not going to give you loads of time. So I'll give you 5 minutes. Have a go, jot them down, see what you come up with. Right, okay, let's have a look at this then. So the camera's a bit dark, one second. Doesn't make much difference. Okay. Right, what have we got here? Fairly simple and straightforward, but it's a good example of the sort of question you might have to deal with. So let's have a look. So the audit staff and the clients have joined a meal together to start of the audit. That's fine. And this year, instead of a meal, all the client staff will go away to a weekend luxury hotel. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Weekend away from the kids. Oh, wrong. Yeah, that sounds good, but probably not. Okay, so what you need to be looking at on this one is this insignificant or trivial? So for hospitality, in order to accept it, it must be insignificant, trivial. This is unlikely to be the case. So this is self-interest, or you could say familiarity. Right, because now this is the key bit. Okay, what people tend to do is leave it at that. Hospitality must be insignificant and trivial. This is unlikely to be the case in this instance. So it's a self-interest familiarity threat. And and you're saying something like, you're going to be less likely to raise issues or challenge if you're familiar. Okay, so you build up a relationship with the client, you're then less likely to challenge them, or you're too familiar with them to actually raise any issues. Therefore, you should not accept. Okay, so you'd need to be hitting all those points. You'd need to be saying why it's a threat, what the threat is, why that constitutes a problem, and then whether you should do it or not, or what the upshot of that is. Justin, does it matter which threat you say between self-interest familiarity? Do you need both? No, I don't think it matters in that one. I think you get your marks either way. So it's one of those two. I think it could be either. So no, one is fine. Okay, so we should politely decline it and just say, look, let's just stick to the meal. Okay, so that would be fine. The meal is inconsequential, I think. Okay, what about the next one? It's been suggested the fee is negotiated based on a percentage. Well, that's an easy one. That is a self-interest threat. And that's because it's now in your interest that the profit would increase. It's called a contingent fee. And it is not allowed. They can't do it. So you can't accept that. You need to speak to the audit committee. Self-interest, I should say. Okay, so it's a clear self-interest threat. You would now be, it would be beneficial to you for them to earn more profit. You're auditing those financial statements. That cannot be the case. You're not allowed to do it very clearly. So you cannot go ahead with that. Okay, so that's actually an easy one if you know and you're able to describe it. Now you only need 2 of these. So that's one you could easily have done. And you've been approached to help identify potential targets. And this is not to do with fees. So they've said the fees are going to be fine. So what is this? This is primarily self-review, and within that, what's called management threat. So acting in the interest of management, or acting as management, making judgmental decisions. So you cannot make judgmental decisions. However, this is advice. You can offer advice. If you're going to offer this, well, then you could put safeguards such as separate teams. Okay, so separate teams in place. Let me make that a bit smaller so you can see it. Okay, so it's a self-review threat. You're potentially making management decisions. You can't make judgment. So you're going to have to put some safeguards in place at the very least, such as separate teams working on the audit, and maybe having a different manager, and certainly not having the same audit team doing that work. Okay, I think those are reasonably straightforward, but what it does show is the benefit of going through in detail the chapter on ethics and specifically knowing it's really a set of rules. I know they call it principles, but it's really not. There's a set of rules for all of these threats and all of these safeguards where they're listed, and there's loads of them, and you just need to go through and know enough of them so that when it comes up, you can apply them. Okay, does that question make sense to everyone? Can you give me a thumbs up or a tick if you're happy? Give me a question if you want to check any aspect of that or anything you're not sure of around ethics. No, good. Right, okay. Right, let's take the first of our breaks now then, because we're going to start into planning, which is a big topic next. So let's take a little bit of a break. It is 10:17 now. So we'll have our longer break now. So we'll sort of do long break, short break, long break. So we'll have 20 minutes now. So that'll give you enough time to go and get something to eat, cup of coffee. We'll be back here for audit planning. So I'll put a timer up on the screen, and do please then check your time and come back in 20 minutes. Okay, so do get away from the screen because it can be a long day sitting at it, and I'll see you then.